Good evening and a very warm welcome to this book release function by two remarkable authors and illustrated by a wonderful designer. So may I invite Mamta on stage, and this way. We're supposed to greet you with a scarf. Okay, this is like the Vida ceremony or the Jaimal in weddings, that way you have to repeat it for the photographer. Arthy, please. And Anirudh. You have to. The photographer is the master of ceremonies. Thank you. Come. I really did want to just sort of start by welcoming all of you for being here to celebrate a remarkable book about a remarkable man. It's a remarkable book because through the simplicity and yet the nuance and the depth of 100 anecdotes, it tells a remarkable story of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And it will not have been an easy task to select 100 anecdotes. But I think in bold strokes of the pen and some wonderful complementary design from Anirudh, the book tells a great story. I'm going to ask the authors to share with us some reflections of what working on the book meant to them personally. And they have very impressive bio notes, and it would be an injustice not to sort of read some of it to you. And they're both children's writers and editors. Arthy is a freelance journalist. She has published over 35 books for children with major publishers from Penguin to Donnelly to Mango Books, and it's a long list. And for 14 years, she was the editor of the Limca Book of Records. And I really, came across both Arthy and Mamta with their very remarkable book on Gandhi and telling his life with anecdotes. And that's how our relationship began. And I've been deeply privileged and blessed to know both of them and to have worked with them. But Arthy, we'll just start with a few reflections from what impact working on the book had on you.
First of all, thank you all for coming. Basically, it would have been not possible at all without Mr. Mehrotra's help, RM's help, sorry. And with material and time and getting in touch with His Holiness' office in Dharamshala, all of it would have been impossible. This book was, I think, one of the toughest books I've ever co-authored, ever, in terms of the fact that it's somebody I thoroughly admired, but from a distance earlier. And as somebody, because my mother considers herself a Buddhist, and her way of life sort of, now when I was doing the research we were doing the research on Dalai Lama, it sort of made sense to me why she called herself a Buddhist. And it also made it difficult for me to sort of aspire to be, because being a Buddhist is not easy, I realized. And at some point, probably, I'll come to the point of being able to emulate her life. And doing research on the Dalai Lama, we found it was, all that I had known of him. I come from a tiny little place in Coorg, which is very close to a place called Bailakuppe, which is one of the largest and the first Tibetan settlements in India. When Jawaharlal Nehru was asking states to give land for settlements, Karnataka was the first state that offered. So the largest Tibetan settlement, other than Dharamshala, is in Bailakuppe. So I have been exposed to the art and the culture and the fabulous, temples and stuff like, and the ceremonies from a distance. But here it was up close, and for almost 1.5 years of research, I realized I had come to being literally, there's no other word for it, fangirl. I mean, there is no other word for it. And when I was asked, like, when we could have somebody to do a session with us earlier in New York, and I just jokingly said Richard Gere, and then because he wasn't free, he was traveling in some other part of America.
Some comparison.
Yes, no. At least I get to meet you. I don't get to meet Richard Gere. So I said, I mean, if I had a choice between Richard Gere, and I think he mentioned once earlier at some function, I think in the White House, I think you had mentioned at the White House, where Richard Gere was also there, and the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, was there. And the crowds are obviously, I mean, everybody expected them to be going to Richard Gere, but no, it was like to His Holiness, which I could, after doing all the research, came to, I mean, that's exactly what had happened to me. And I've been pestering RM for a while, saying, now, by March next year, we have to meet and hand over the book personally, or else, Ms. RM. So it's been the most difficult, but I think the book I'm most proud of all the books that I've done so far.
Mamta Nainy also writes books for children and an editor, and has authored numerous books and for very major publishing houses, again, Karadi Tales, Katha, Puffin, and many of her books are on the CBSE and NCERT recommended list of schools. And most recently, she was working as a consultant editor with Katha. And they are both the founding partners of what they call Syllables 27. I'm not sure what the 27 stands for. Maybe she'll tell us, which is an independent publishing venture that started about 4 years ago, and works on a turnkey basis for publishers and organizations that work with children. And they too, in that capacity, have collaborated with many leading organizations: Puffin Random House, World Wildlife Fund, Intac, Talking Club, Speaker Tree, Westland Amazon, and Full Circle. So Mamta, really the same question to you as sort of introductory comments before we plunge deep into it.
So basically, as you mentioned, that it is a part of a series, this book, and there are 5 books in the series. 3 are already out. The first book in the series was on Mahatma Gandhi, and it happened, I think it came out in 2019 when we were celebrating the 150th birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. And we wanted to do a book on Gandhi, and we started researching, and we looked at a lot of books, and we found that most of those books were kind of paper dry. They were very textbookish. So we thought that maybe it might be a good idea to do a book which has some anecdotes, little anecdotes, unusual stories about the Mahatma that kind of bring out the human behind the Mahatma. Most books that we researched either painted a picture of the Mahatma as this great political leader who was very involved in the freedom struggle, or like they painted a picture of him as a great saint. So we thought that maybe we should have like a collection of stories that kind of give an insight into how his mind worked in the most ordinary situations. So that's how the first book in the series happened. And then the book did decently well. And the next year was 2020. It was Satyajit Ray, the great filmmaker, centenary year. So we thought maybe we'll do a book on again with Satyajit Ray. A lot of people know him as a great filmmaker, but there are these various creative aspects of him that not many people outside of Bengal know. So not many people know that he was an illustrator or a children's author or a translator, and even in terms of filmmaking, how he was involved in the various aspects of filmmaking. So we brought out the second book in the series, which was on Satyajit Ray. And then it was, I think it came around May, I think around his birthday in 2020. And then we both sat down and we wanted to decide who we are going to work on next. And we almost immediately decided that it had to be His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because we are both very, very inspired by his philosophies and ideas. And that's how we started working on this book. And I think one of the major reasons as to why we were able to it was at the peak of the pandemic, and there was a lot going on around all of us. And I think a major part of how we were able to deal with all the anxiety of what was happening all around was this book, because during the course of the pandemic, this is what we sort of clung on to. And this is, I think, it came as a blessing, because this is what we were working on. And yeah, and I think the basic idea behind this book is not to just sort of, and for the entire series as well, is not to just talk about the achievements of these people, these greater than life sort of icons, but also to bring it in a way that children sort of relate to these stories, and they feel that the costumes are sort of interchangeable. So they see themselves in these great, remarkable people. So that was the idea behind these books, and that's how this entire series kind of came together. And of course, we went to Mr. Mehrotra, and he was very kind to offer us whatever support we wanted for the book in terms of research, writing the foreword, like all those things that he helped us with. So we're very, very thankful to Mr. Mehrotra for helping us with this book.
So I'd like to invite Anirudh Mukherjee, who's done the in a very simple but very evocative and subtle, almost not there. But when you see them, they're very startling, and they, in wonderful ways, complement the text. So just a few opening remarks, Anirudh, as to how you approached the complexity of a simple text and found a visual equivalence for them, which were not literal, but yet evocative.
It was a challenge, and I got a lot of material, and that was the help from Arthy and Mamta, and I had to go through them and studied them, and we decided upon a style which was, why it was simple, because I think his life was simple, and he was a man who lived a different kind of a life. He was not a, where there was not a clamor of, layers of various things, where things become very complicated. So we try to bring in those elements in my drawing, and in the design of the book also. So it was essentially a reverse, if you see the book, then it is a very linear kind of a quality which we have in those illustrations, and they are in reverse. So in reverse, where they stand out with the text. So the illustrations, they become part of the text. So it is like text and illustrations, they are almost complementing each other. So that was the whole idea, and the whole series has the same effect and the same the manner how we have dealt with. So that's how it started. So.
Congratulations to the authors and the designer, and I think this is the moment to pause after the introductions and formally release the book. So let's just stand up. And so congratulations, Anirudh, Mamta, Arthy, and thank you for this. Thank you.
Can I just add something? Yes. I'd like to add that what's also remarkable is it's not just done by Aniruddha himself. He works with his daughter Charulata on all the books. So they worked on it together. They get credit on it together, and we don't really know who's done which illustration specifically. But they worked on all the 3 books, and they will be working on the other 2 books as well. So it's a combined father-daughter enterprise, which is also quite unusual, actually.
Tell me, Mamta, that what is the singular strand that emerged for you? Anirudh just described and said, he's a simple man, yet a life that is extremely complex and challenging and rich. And he describes himself as a simple Buddhist monk. So what are some of the strands of who he is that emerged while you were writing?
Okay, so while we were researching this book, we spoke to a lot of people. We haven't really met His Holiness, and I think that in itself is kind of teaching us patience. I think when the time is right, we'll definitely meet him. But while researching this book, we spoke to a lot of people We saw a lot of interviews. We scoured a lot of like newspapers and books and websites. And we not just saw interviews of His Holiness, but we also saw interviews of people who have closely worked with him or people who have met him. And all of them had very similar things to say about him. So most of them felt a certain calm in the presence of His Holiness. Most of them felt as if even when they met him for the first time, they felt as if they have known him forever. It's almost like meeting a long-lost friend or a family senior. And he exudes that certain sort of warmth. So while we were discussing the book, we thought, how can everybody have some were so overwhelmed that they started crying. So how can everybody have similar sort of experience while meeting His Holiness? And then we read some more and we researched some more, and we found something which was very interesting, which His Holiness himself says. He puts it as the art of attention. So when you're engaging with somebody, you engage with a child's curiosity and a scholar's excitement. So I find these words very, very interesting and inspirational. And he also kind of says that it's the joyful participation in this world of sorrows. So how do you participate in it? How do you engage with people and keep that excitement alive? How you listen to them, not with your ears, but with your heart. So I think that's one thing that is a major takeaway for me while I worked on this book. And another thing, I think, while we were working on this book, I realized that you just cannot create something alone. Like all these people, like, it takes a village to kind of put a book together. The cover only has the author's name, but there are illustrators, designers, editors, production people, marketing people, partner organizations, sales people, and of course readers. So there are so many people who are coming together and participating in this art of creation, right? So, and that again goes back to His Holiness, what he says of how everything in this universe is kind of interconnected. We are all like a constellation, no? Each being is very bright and beautiful and everything, but we are connected all the same. So I think that's what it's again this idea which is very very important in Buddhism, which is the idea of shunyata, which most people translate as emptiness or nothingness. But His Holiness says that this is actually, it translates to a being which is empty of independent entity, independent identity. So there's nothing which is independent. So I think that's what really kind of resonated with me while working on this book. And I think it's something that's going to stay with me for a long, long time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mamta. You really, touched on two very key elements of His Holiness's teachings and who he is. And we'll come to some of the other elements of the basic pillars of his philosophy. And certainly interconnectedness and interdependence is one of them. And I think it forms the basis of his teachings on compassion, that the minute we recognize that our lives, our very survival, are dependent on other people, and thank you, Mamta, for giving us the example of all that went into the production of the book, and for that to be on the table here, and in fact for all of us to have assembled here this evening. And when we begin to look at all sentient beings, in fact not just human beings, as elements in this fabric of our existence, then we inevitably end up feeling a sense of compassion for the other. And I think it's also, this aspect of the juxtaposition of joy when there is sorrow. And how on earth do you recognize that? And I think it is the Dalai Lama's ability to have, and that's why I think that your use of the word joy is very significant, and it gives me a sense of how accurately you have captured this, because we normally talk about happiness, and I think happiness has had found shades of the aspiration of the American Constitution, and as to what is it that makes you happy. And it usually are material objects, and you have an unsatiable grasp for things that are material, and when you recognize the other pillar that goes with this, and that is really impermanence. So His Holiness is talking about interdependence, and he's talking about impermanence, but more of impermanence later. And to ask you, Arthy, that of the anecdotes in the book, which did you find the most, how do I put it, illuminating? Because there are all these philosophical elements, but obviously they find expression in specific anecdotes that reveal the man. So some of them are, of course, there for sort of chronological detail. I mean, we have to talk about when he was born, we have to talk about his arrival in India, etc., etc. But there are many who reveal the man. So give us an example of an anecdote that revealed the man for you.
Going back to what Mamta was talking about, doing this book during the pandemic, and a friend of mine had told me, very excitedly, she called up and she said, we'd gone to Dharamshala and we just happened to be there on the day when he was, His Holiness was having an audience. And her daughter had come back from New York because she was really, very upset living alone, and she'd come away giving up her job there. And the three of them walked into the room, and the girl entered the room, and she just burst into tears the moment she saw the Holiness. And the Holiness got up and just stood up, and she just ran into his arms, and for 15 minutes she was crying, and she said it was just an extraordinary thing that happened. The girl kept crying, and His Holiness kept sweating, and he looked more and more anguished. And this girl, by the end of 15 minutes, she sank to the ground, and His Holiness wouldn't let her go. And by the time she got up and she left, her parents came and took her in, and she came back and she said, everything is okay. Everything is okay. And, it was almost like as if this mother told me, it's almost like as if he took away everything that she was anguished about in the last 1 year of living alone in New York and trying to manage life. And she was ready. It seemed like one of those miracle, cliched stories you hear about. But when you hear it from somebody just so well, I've known that little girl since she was 6 years old. And, to hear it from knowing that she's experienced it, one of the new age millennium kids, been there, done that. What's the Holiness all about? But for her to experience this, because she was forced to come for that meeting, she wasn't really keen on going for the Dalai Lama meeting. And for her to acknowledge the fact that there is somebody here who is not just thinking of himself at all, he's thinking of everybody who comes in touch with him in any small way. And whether it's giving joy, or whether taking away your anguish, or being compassionate, at his age, and after all that he's gone through, look at his life. It's like a movie. There's a movie that's made, 2 or 3 movies made on him. But just watching that, how does he keep his sense of compassion? How does he keep that sense of joy going? Most of us would have collapsed by now. He's still looking forward to meeting people. He's still taking away somebody's anguish. He's giving joy, and he meets everybody as he's meeting them for the first. And if he's meeting them for the first time, he's getting everything, like he's listening to you. His attention is just only on you. And this girl, this is one example that I know of because it's so close. It's like when you've heard about other people, it's not like that close. You've known this girl since she was 6. She's 27 years old now. And that's one thing about his compassion, and it's a personal account I was talking about. And regarding the anecdote in the book, the ones that are linked to the animals, that is, to nature, and is, this very childlike. Starting from the little mouse, when he was a little kid, the only companion he had, when he was taken, he was what do you call congregated? Would it be congregated the word? When he was made the ruler, of the Tibetan people. And for him, the responsibility at that time to be able to take it on and realize that, okay, this little mouse is also somebody like me. It's part of the world. And the relationship with the cat. And, it's actually quite amazing. And I said, I'm sorry if I come across really like a fangirl, but I really am. So all these things are and one thing I wanted to read out from the book, which we started the book on, which is something so simple and so comes across as being really cliched. But I think, especially post-pandemic, I think it's something, it starts like, be kind whenever possible. It is always possible. It's so cliched and so simple, and somebody would probably say it's simplistic, but it's simple and so easy to do. It's so easy to just follow. And in post-pandemic, I think it's a lesson that all of us could really emulate and take forward for the rest of our lives, if we know what's good for us. That's getting carried away, sorry.
No. But it is and that's one of the remarkable features of the book. I mean, some of the anecdotes include, a piece about the bird, the cat, and the mouse. So the fact that, in narrating such a rich story and 100 anecdotes, you create space in the book to capture things as as complicated perhaps, or as nuanced as the Dalai Lama's commitment to a conversation, for example, with science. So even though he's sort of the preeminent Buddhist monk, he has a deep a passion and a commitment to respond to contemporary knowledge, no matter where it comes from and what its source is, and other ancient wisdom. So he has the capacity to and the willingness to, go into a mosque and perform the namaz, to go to a gurdwara and sit there and participate in the qurbani, and to sit down with scientists and look at what he can learn from the scientists and what the scientists might be able to learn from him. So this is not merely a kind of syncretic harking back to a past glory, where you claim that modern science is only confirming what we already knew several thousand years ago, whether it was space travel or being able to transplant an elephant's head on a human body. So it is this vast inclusiveness of the Dalai Lama that emerges in this book. Both of you have spoken in some ways about how the book impacted you personally. But when you look back through the process of writing the book, and you've spoken about two extremely complex and difficult to understand for lay people, the idea of shunyata, and I will offer you my reflections on that in a minute. But can you give us some instances of ways in which you have felt that you are responding differently to particular situations? I mean, can you give us some examples as to how this has impacted you? Because, very often we feel impacted, and we feel moved and impressed when we read a narrative, but unless it embeds itself as a deep realization, our reflexive responses are not impacted. So it is true that His Holiness travels around the world, and millions of people listen to him, and fewer millions, but many of them feel impacted and transformed. But when it comes to everyday reflexive responses to life, it hasn't really been transforming. So in what ways have you felt changed?
So there's this anecdote in this book, and I also, while going through a lot of interviews of His Holiness, I found that he's not afraid to say that I don't know. There's this anecdote in this book which is actually kind of taken from an interview that Pico Iyer was conducting with His Holiness, and he talks about the wisdom of ignorance. And how, it goes back to this famous quote by Socrates, where he says that the only thing I know is that I don't know anything. So earlier, when I used to do sessions with children, I was always very afraid to say that I don't know. Maybe I don't have the answer, because they're looking up to me for answers. So I realized that you don't always have to know. You can actually say that I don't know. There's a certain humility in saying that I don't know, and I am also trying to find these answers along with you. So I felt that is how I think on a day-to-day basis, or when I'm interacting with not just children but with others as well, there's no harm in saying that I don't know. If you don't know, just say that you don't know. So I think that's something that that I have tried to kind of do in my sessions and otherwise also. So I think, that's one thing.
On the issue of I don't know, the context of that is twofold. One is that you really don't know, and the second context is that, for example, when the Buddha attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, And when he stepped out, he didn't know what to do because he'd had this experience and he didn't have the terms of reference or the vocabulary to be able to communicate that experience, because the experience was a non-conceptual one. And so I frequently use this analogy, which I've learned from His Holiness, that if you haven't tasted coffee, how can I tell you what coffee tastes like? So the safest response, when it is something that you just intuit and you can't give it form and structure within a shared vocabulary, you have the honesty to say, I don't know, rather than saying, well, I can't express it, but I really know. And so I think it's his ability to navigate these nuances from a deep felt sense of humility. And so he describes himself always as, I am just a simple Buddhist monk, and I am an aspiring bodhisattva. And I think it's important to sort of place this in context, that the Dalai Lama is considered an incarnation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha aspect of compassion. And its highest ideal is that of a bodhisattva, which means that unlike, say, in our Hindu tradition, where we seek moksha, which means that we seek a degree of knowledge and wisdom, that we can break out of the cycle of birth and rebirth and merge with Atman, but that's another philosophical discussion. But here the Buddha sought Nirvana, and His Holiness seeks Nirvana, so that he can choose to take rebirth in human form in order to teach and serve humanity and continue to experience the struggles of being in human form, birth, old age, sickness, and death. So his commitment to compassion is so deep and profound that he has committed himself to being reborn. And time permitting, we'll talk about what happens when to the idea of the next Dalai Lama. But I don't want to let you go, Arthy. So what was your transforming experience or a shift that you felt in significant ways?
Primarily, to start with, I think it started with his reaction to the aggression of the Chinese, which I found really overwhelming. And also, I knew about it in terms of history and things like that. But when researching the book, there was like specific details of like starting from the age of 4, when he was born onwards, and where the oppression came closer and closer and closer, and he was forced to leave, basically to save his people, and the dilemma that he went through, and in spite of which, his feeling towards the Chinese is like, excuse me, he's not pissed off. I'm sorry to use the word, but that's the only word I could think of. Like, I'm enraged, And the thing is, he's got compassion, and he feels like, maybe this open to dialogue, and he's been trying, he's been doing everything possible within his power to get them to come to the table and give any kind of compromise from his side for his entire people. And nothing seems to be making any difference. But that doesn't stop him, for one thing, and it hasn't changed his stance towards looking at them with compassion again. How can you look at somebody? Compassion has taken away your country, for God's sake, and the number of people that they've killed. So I think the thing of looking at compassion differently is what I got from the... compassion is not just petting a dog or feeding a stray animal on the way, or, being nice to your servant during COVID. It means a lot more. And I think I've been striving and working hopefully towards it to some extent. And I'll get there soon, hopefully. But I think my whole outlook towards compassion has changed drastically, especially taking the whole gamut of His Holiness's life from the time he was born till he's now 86? 86? 87. Yeah, 87 birthday, yes. Oh, God, yeah.
Was that I saw that the prayer mats that the monks used said, pray for the Chinese. And every morning's prayer, I don't know if that still happens, but certainly till 10, 12 years ago when I spent a length of time in Dharamsala did, was every morning's prayer used to start with, may the veils of ignorance lift from the Chinese. And so this belief that the Chinese were doing what they were doing because of their ignorance. And a story that His Holiness narrates very often as the aspiration of how compassionate we need to be or might be was that there was a physician called Dr. Tenzin Chodak, who was a Tibetan physician, personal physician to the institution of the Dalai Lamas way back in Tibet. And he was picked up by the Chinese and he was tortured and he spent 30 years in the Gulag. And when he came into exile in the 80s, and I was privileged to have him read my pulse, when His Holiness asked him that what was the most difficult time for you in the Chinese prisons, and most people expected him to say when I was thrashed or flogged, or when they asked me to defecate on a money stone or whatever it was. But he said, when momentarily I found my compassion for my Chinese torturers flag for a moment. So that was a degree of compassion that is the ideal. And just talking a little bit, taking the idea of compassion further, because it's so intimately related to the Dalai Lama, and that is that today one of the cornerstones of his teaching and philosophy, apart from interconnectedness and impermanence, is nurturing compassion. And not just nurturing compassion because it's sort of in some abstract way virtuous or highly moral, but also that it's very practical. And they have done sort of a lot of psychological testing and found that people who are struggling with themselves and their minds tend to use the word I, me, mine in interviews or diagnostic conversations. So what compassion really does is it softens that sense of the I. I am suffering, I am feeling pain. So it's the I. So by sort of training oneself to be outer directed, the sense of that I that experiences suffering softens. So we see repeatedly in articulations of His Holiness and his practice and his teachings that they stand up to the scrutiny of reason and logic, even as that juxtaposes with experience. So I think the genius of course, His Holiness, but also of our civilizational heritage, is that it offers reasoned, intellectual perspectives and insights, even as it offers specific methods in order to achieve those non-conceptual states and experiences that over a period of time can be transforming so that our reflexive responses are affected. So it's not enough that we have this conversation, we share some of our insights. You may be impressed, you may not be, but you may be impressed and say, how wonderful. This is something that His Holiness is able to do that. But the teaching really involves both. How do you achieve that state of being? And that, in sense, in some ways, the minor missing link, because it's not really easy to capture in an anecdote as to what the method that the Dalai Lama has used. I mean, though he was reincarnated as Tenzin Gyatso, the young boy who was declared to be the heir to the institution of the Dalai Lama. It was hard work, and he talks about his isolation. He talks about peering through a telescope from the Potala Palace at children playing and envying them, and that to go through the gamut of human emotion, to weep when his tutor died, and on the issue of happiness, I mean, he would say, how can I be happy when someone else is suffering? I can only understand that suffering and try and help and make a difference and find the equanimity. So equanimity is really what he embodies, which to us is joyful. But from his experience, it's the balance between feeling your pain and feeling the possibility of in the human condition of people transcending that pain. And it is the coexistence of those two that gives us a sense of reassuring, infectious comfort and joy. I think maybe open this to the audience for any thoughts, reflections, and questions. The gentleman is, by the way, an author and a poet. So please, yes, sir.
Is Shunya, zero. And zero, the circle, it's there's no beginning, there's no end. That is life, actually. We are part of the same universe. So, just a thought. Thank you.
Well,
These are the prayer beads of...
Yes.
But that's a beautiful interpretation.
Interpretation, yeah, it's fantastic. But we never thought that this is his interpretation of the prayer beads. Yeah.
Well, you know that Shunya is one of the complexities of our civilization, and we invented the zero, and the zero in Western mathematics was merely occupying a space and creating the number of digits. But I think that Shunya is not really alluding to zero, because zero is conventionally understood is nothing or the absence of something. And as I think Mamta pointed out, that well, a little aside, and the challenge of books like this, and for people writing in the English language of non-conceptual experiences, is that the early translators, who even as recently as the 70s and 80s, who began to translate both Sanskrit terms and certainly Tibetan Buddhist terms, have got us into a lot of trouble, which is now very difficult to erase. So, for example, the Buddha, when he talked about dukkha, it got translated as suffering. And perhaps the more accurate description of that is dissatisfaction or the surrender of craving or what have you. And I think that the word that has had the hardest hit has been the idea of shunya. And so we talk about the common phrase that is used as the emptiness of inherent existence. But it still brings in the word of the idea of empty of something. And I think what it really is a closer analogy comes from developing the idea of dependence or interdependence. And so again, to use the example of coffee, so what it's really saying is using what is now borne out by Western science, the idea of causality, that everything has a cause and a condition. And so they're deeply interwoven. So if you if you were to look at coffee ice cream, so coffee ice cream depends on one of the sort of very important causes and conditions is the temperature. So if the temperature changes, either the cause and the condition in which ice cream exists changes, then it's no longer ice cream. It's melted something else. And even if you were to try to reconstitute it, it wouldn't be the same ice cream. So what they're really saying with Shunya is that all phenomena, not just objects, are dependent on causes and conditions. And when the causes and conditions change, they change. So what that does is, another sort of, just a little sort of anecdote, that whenever I meet His Holiness, he will usually conclude our meeting with saying, practice, practice, practice. And what is that practice? The practice is to try and internalize our understanding of the true nature of reality. So what it does is that the minute we realize that the ice cream is dependent on causes and conditions, as is this microphone, as is my very existence, it softens the self-obsession with the self, and it softens our obsession with the object. So we recognize that not only is the object impermanent, it is subject to change, and that it is dependent on causes and conditions. So what it does is, once we have deeply internalized it, it softens our grasping. So whether we grasp at a relationship or another human being, so the approach in the Tibetan tradition is antidotal, which means that if you are in an obsessive relationship, then what would be the antidote to be able to realize its true nature? Would be to reflect and meditate on that person's impermanence, and then to look at that person, say, aging. Is the person that I am obsessed about going to be the same person through the, etc., etc., etc.? So the whole exercise is around, this is the shunya idea is the core, but it isn't emptiness, or it isn't nothing. If at all, it is, and I would look for another word, it is empty of independent existence. And I think that His Holiness, his ability to embody this and deeply internalize it is what makes him the final, finished human being that he is. So it's not that this man and the elements of his consciousness and brain are sort of broken up into details or can be analyzed by an analyst in terms of causality and effect, that because he had all these traumatic experiences when he was young, If he had them, he has obviously managed to cleanse his consciousness from their imprints, which is why at age 87 he is in such magnanimous flow. And it comes from this very core approach of compassion, interdependence, shunya, connectedness. Sorry, any other questions? It's been a long...
How much time you took to make this book? You exceeded the time, and there are 100 anecdotes. There are many more. On what basis they were selected?
You want to take it?
I was hoping nobody would ask that question, actually, because that was the toughest job, because we'd already decided on the 100. And so, the number was already decided, and it was already okay with the publisher. And we thought, but leaving out, and also we had to be very careful with some of the anecdotes on the Chinese, because you have to sort of balance the political situation and not get into trouble and not have the book banned, and combination of so many things that we had to look into. And given a choice, I'd probably put in a lot more on the Chinese aggression, which is obviously not on my path of compassion, not on the path of compassion. But the toughest job was what to leave out. Really what to leave out. It was a very, very tough job. And like it was for Gandhi, 150 anecdotes were just, we were actually thinking maybe we should persuade the publishers to do book 1 and 2 or something like that. And we'd probably, we've got enough for another 2-3 books maybe on His Holiness, actually. So the toughest job was picking the 100. RM helped.
I think I'd like to add to that. Since this book is meant for younger readers, we actually tried to kind of put His Holiness's ideas and philosophies in context for the younger readers. So there are a lot of anecdotes that we wanted to fit, because every anecdote kind of gave a rare insight into how his mind works, what are his ideas and philosophies. But we chose those that. The first thing was to kind of loosely follow a biographical timeline, and plus each one of these anecdotes kind of talk about a certain aspect of His Holiness and places His Holiness in context for younger readers. So that was the idea. So for example, Arthy just spoke about the quotes that we open the book with: be kind whenever possible, it's always possible. So how do you break that down for children? So for example, when I read that quote, I always think of this quote by the famous American writer Jack Kerouac, where he says that I hope someday I find the right words, and I hope that they are simple. So and here's a man who has found the right words that are simple. So he's not somebody who kind of propagates like lofty ideas and kind of gives long discourses, but here are things that are simple, practical, some things that you can do every day. So we wanted to kind of bring those things into this book, because I think children naturally are very kind. When we begin our lives as children, we are kind. But somewhere along the way, in the process of growing up, we kind of slip into the adult apathy, and we kind of start to think in terms of us versus others, so the othering of the other happens. And most people think of kindness as like, because it is propagated that way, that kindness is actually simple acts of kindness. That you can, but there is more to kindness. It needs to be cultivated, right? It's kind of knowing the person beyond understanding them. So there could be a million things that you don't understand about the other person. There might be things that you don't agree with. Maybe they have truths that you're not comfortable with. But how do you look beyond those and be compassionate, be kind? How do you cultivate that? So therein, I think, come the ideas of emotional hygiene, of what His Holiness talks about. Like, how do you kind of rid your mind of the destructive emotions and make space for compassion that could be a source of joy. So I think all these things we wanted to bring, and that was the focus of this book. So how do you lead to that? So that was the idea, and that's how these 100 anecdotes kind of were put together. So that was the whole thought process behind these.
Well, I think it's been brilliantly done, because there are endearing pieces in this about when His Holiness, his aversion to study, and when he was young, and how his tutors used to threaten him, but he could tease them because he knew that he was a special child and he was being treated specially. So even when they threatened to beat him up, he knew that they couldn't do that. And so, that kind of interplay, or when he, receives these gifts, a series of gifts from different people, and he's charmed most of all by the Meccano. I don't know how many of you remember the Meccano. And that was a pointer to later in his life, that he had the sort of the interest, which he still does. Well, not still, but till, I would say, about 10 years ago, of opening up watches and opening up the Lasa's only projector, and his interest with mechanical things. And I think also that this remarkable ease with which he can speak to whoever he meets at whatever level. So to engage with a child, almost like a child, and to engage with a neuroscientist about the neurology of the brain, with a physicist, and with fellow monks, with the complexity, the enormous complexity of Buddhist ideas and theory. And the interesting thing that circumscribes this is till very recently, certainly till he's 87, certainly till his 80th birthday, or around that time, that he would receive initiation, transmission, and instructions of the oral traditions from monks younger than himself. So, though he is the sort of the preeminent Buddhist monk, he was open to learning regardless of seniority, in a sense, or the hierarchies of Buddhist ideas. Any further questions? Yes, sir. Two. But 1, 2, 3. Sorry. Okay, 4. Okay, 4, and then. Yes. Okay. Sure.
So, Mamta, you brought upon this point about selecting the anecdotes that were meaningful for kids. And I'd like to ask you, Arthy, if I can't wait to get started on the book, so just a sneak preview. Do you have stuff about habits that the Dalai Lama follows with regard to eating or sleeping or stuff like that?
Yes, we have anecdotes in the book which talk about vegetarianism, for example. So there are like a lot of anecdotes in the latter part of the book. We have anecdotes regarding to the habits as well.
That leaves a big impact.
Sir, we'll come to the 2 questions at the back and then wind up. Sir.
I have 3 small questions. Like the one in the book, maybe Anirudh can answer it. Like it looks like a hair comb. So one looks like a hair comb. And secondly, what if I may ask, what is the concept of nothingness you talked about? And thirdly, which are the next 2 books in the series of 5 books? This is the 3rd book. Thank you.
Publisher it's coming out next year. Maybe we'll see you here next year. And the one the year after.
The hair comb idea is, it has emanated from, there is a particular style which we call lino cut. So it is a piece of rubber or a wood on which you engrave things. So which is a very old style of expressing art. So the idea came from that when you engrave through a wood or a piece of rubber pad or something. So it is either called woodcut or it is called linocut or it is called it is a graphic medium. So that was the base of the idea. So from where this whole idea came up, and we try to keep this and these lines are giving it a some kind of a unity, a style throughout the illustrations, where even in the other books also we have dealt with the same style and the same manner where we have created this series of illustrations in the other 3 books also. So and they're very because of the simplicity, they look they come out very very easy to see or comprehend, to understand, because there was a limitation of 2 color over this book. So there was a challenge of 2 colors. So one is the red, the background, and there was a white. So we had to work with 2 colors. So we thought this is the best thing to go with, so that's the whole idea.
Well,
Thank you.
As a compliment to the illustration, he has illustrated the horror of at Nobulinka when His Holiness was listening on the radio to what was unfolding before his escape. And I've had the privilege of going to and seeing that radio. And this is a perfect sort of illustration of that. So you must have done a lot of research to get it right. Tucked away in Lhasa under sort of Chinese occupation. Jyoti, you had a question.
The question is actually not from me, but from my nephew, Rohan Nijhavan. He has special needs, so he can't ask it himself, and therefore I'm asking it on his behalf. And this is what he's written on his phone. Hello, I'm Rohan Nijhavan. I'm a poet and a philosopher. His Holiness had a huge impact on my life. I had the privilege of meeting him 3 years ago, right before COVID hit. Can you please share your thoughts on reincarnation and how it's the true nature of reality? How do you know that beings are reincarnated?
A brief answer to, I'm just tempted to say, I don't know. but I know, since the young man has asked this question, I will attempt with an answer with deep humility. I think that this is explained in Buddhist terms through the principle of causality and continuity, that everything has a cause. And so the Buddhists argue that at the time of conception, when the sperm and the egg unite, and life is formed, where does consciousness come from? Modern science argues that it's purely biochemical, and so consciousness is a product of the biochemistry of the sperm and the egg coming together as it grows into human form. We argue that what happens when you die is that we already know that the mind has different layers. There's the gross mind, then the conscious and the subconscious. These are fairly familiar concepts. But once you go from the subconscious, you have increasingly subtle layers of consciousness, which float around in a state of being called bardo. And so it's not tangible or concrete. It's again like the ice cream. So when the cause and the conditions are ripe, which means that when that subtle, for want of a better word, energy, finds an egg and a sperm coming together, that forms the condition for the consciousness to become a part of the fetus. And so that is how reincarnation happens. And when you are an evolved being, like the Dalai Lama and some other lamas, at that stage of subtle consciousness, you are able to choose the sperm and the egg where it will be placed. And that is how, so it could be happening, as in the case of the Dalai Lama, when he was born, the subtle mind of the 13th found a sperm and an egg which was appropriate in the province of Amdo in Takstar for a couple, and on the basis of some signs and signals that he had left as to where they should look for him. So there was that continuity of the subtlest aspect of mind which carries the imprints of our karma. And again, a little sort of aside to that. So it is not karma as we understand in Hinduism as action, but really the intentions. So when we have a motivation, an intention to do something, it creates an imprint in our consciousness, which in this life begins to influence what we do and how we act and how we respond to situations, and is carried over into the next life. And I should point out that it is not necessary that this next life will be in human form. It includes, hence, the idea of all sentient beings, anything that has some element of consciousness. But if you're an evolved Lama, then you are so in control of the subtlest aspects of your mind that you are able to manifest it in a form and manner that will be useful. And so just a remark that, a question is frequently being asked that, the next Dalai Lama, where will he be born? What will he be? Will he be in India, China, etc., etc., etc.? So in summary, what he's saying is that I Tenzin Gyatso, I mean, the I is a nebulous I hasten to add, as an aspiring, because he does not wish to acknowledge that he is a bodhisattva, will take rebirth in a form and manner that is useful. And if it needs to be in the form of the institution or embodying the institution of the Dalai Lama, so be it. But that too, the form could be a woman, it could be in whichever part of the world will be more useful. And so this doctrine of useful as altruism is a very emphatic guiding principle for His Holiness. So whenever we go to him for advice or a project or an idea, his primary yardstick is not, will this promote me? Will this promote my ideas? But will it be useful? So when the idea of this book was put up to him, his only question was, will it be useful? So he wasn't looking for a book about himself because it was a book, but was it in a form and manner that will be useful? And for someone to devote his life and plan and seek his next life is driven by this impetus. Will it be useful? I don't know if that answers the question, but...
I have a suggestion, Mr. Mehrotra.
Yes.
My name is Sridhar.
Hi.
I think if you can change that foreword by Rajiv Mehrotra to the last word of the subject by Mehrotra, that would be great. Because your interpretation was amazing.
You've
got enough material.
Please be careful. You'll give me a very emphatic sense of my I, and that's dangerous. But thank you. Yes, one more question.
Tashi Delek, Namaste. On behalf of all Tibetans in exile and in Tibet, I'm really honored to be here and thank you all. It's so inspiring because I was born in India, in Manali, and I went for Tibetan Children's Village School run by Sister of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I left India in 2000 when I was just 17 for scholarship in Italy. And for the last 22 years, I have never, let's say in India, in Delhi, been to a conference related to the book of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and see, it's so inspiring to see Indians here all together And at His Holiness age of 87, and it's still his words and his work and his mission and his presence is like becoming universal. So it's so beautiful. And I would like to say also, like this 100 for me, I saw like very auspicious that His Holiness lives longer than 100 years, and to be in the service of humanity and sentient beings. And then also I would say 100, maybe like one is like wisdom, and no, one is compassion, and 00 is like wisdom of emptiness, and and which is like embodiment of which His Holiness emulates. And yes, so my question is actually, His Holiness, one of the missions of His Holiness is Chinese dialogue, and to go back to Tibet to go back to Tibet. So is there any experiences or any anecdotes related to Chinese citizens or Chinese government, so to create that dialogue, or any experiences that you felt, or if you have put in the book, this next step?
No, not the next
back
step.
to Tibet.
No, next step, we don't know what the next step of His Holiness is going to be. We've only put in what efforts he's made so far. So what the next steps, I think at this stage, it depends totally on the Chinese. I mean, that's what my take on it would be. Do you have any idea what His Holiness has in mind?
Well, there I'll have to say a genuine I don't know. And I would just sort of conclude by thanking you, and actually thanking the Tibetans and the Tibetan community, because if it hadn't been, in some senses, for the Chinese, you may not have been here. His Holiness has often said that that the Indians were the guru to the Tibetans, and Buddhism traveled from India to Tibet. And what's an interesting aside on that is that traditionally, when religious traditions have spread, they have spread through scripture and text from traders. That's how it happened in ancient times. But the bonding between India and Tibet is so deep because it was Indian Buddhist practitioners who carried Buddhism with them to the Tibetans, not merely the scriptures, but the method, so that they got trained in the methods of Buddhist practice so that they could experience the non-conceptual experiences that we talk about, and they expanded the Tibetan language in order to accommodate those non-conceptual experiences. And so the Tibetans really brought Buddhism in its most authentic form back to India. So students like me of His Holiness feel that the roles have now been reversed, and we have to thank the Tibetan gurus for bringing Buddhism back to the land of the Buddha's birth. So thank you very much.
That would have not happened if His Holiness didn't have to flee from China to Tibet, right?
In fact, that's that was the 13th Dalai Lama, his predecessor, had predicted that this would happen. So who knows? So thank you very much. Okay, one more question, ma'am.
Yeah, you spoke about equanimity. I was reminded of this quote from Gurbani. I want your observation on whether it's the same concept. Jo nar dukh mein dukh nahi mane, sukh sane ar bhay nahi jaake, kanchan mati mane. So that's the same thing, isn't it?
I have to confess that I'm not. It certainly includes this, but I think that it is. What you're really saying is that whether in joy or sorrow, that we share that, and I think that every faith articulates the same or similar principles in its own social and cultural context. And as I mentioned earlier, that I have had the great blessing of going to, with His Holiness, to a Gurdwara or the Alaska Mosque in Israel, and he has engaged in the practices and rituals of different traditions. And most recently, my wife and I were in Ajmer at the Dargah, and the Gadde Shaheen Salman Chishti told us that when His Holiness visited the Dargah, he prostrated flat out and rested his forehead at the feet of where the Khwaja Sahib had been buried, and stayed silent there for several minutes, 10, 15 minutes. And he stood up and said, "Look, I have experienced the divine." And so this is someone who is an agnostic, but had the openness to acknowledge that he had an experience that enriched the totality of his aspiration and who he was. So, I mean, I wouldn't quibble too much about the vocabulary, whether it meant the same thing or similar, but I think that spirit of compassion, and we certainly see it in the Sikh community. I mean, look at the langars during COVID. I mean, they were very fundamental aspects of compassion. Or when the Shaheen Bagh episodes that happened, I mean, they reached out. And I think certainly that is a philosophy that manifests compassion in very concrete ways. So I wouldn't get lost in the semantics of it. So, thank you very much, all of you, for being here, celebrating a remarkable book, two wonderful authors and a remarkable illustrator, and above all, at least to my mind, one of the great human beings of our time. And I feel privileged and blessed to be born when people like this are here. This is what it must have felt like when Gandhiji was around. And someone, I should add, that His Holiness had expressed great reverence to Gandhiji, and when he was accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, he dedicated the Nobel Peace Prize to Gandhiji, who had never got it. And so he dedicated his Nobel Peace Prize to Gandhi. And the Nobel Peace Prize money was donated, a small portion of it came to us at the foundation, but went to Mother Teresa and went to Baba Amte for his work with leprosy. So it's an inclusive paradigm. And thank you for being here and sharing this evening with us. Thank you.